The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body. Hello and a warm welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Cheryl Martin. Welcome also if you're joining us for the first time. In this first season of the podcast, we've been exploring what it means to have good health, well-being and to perform at our best. And as an emergency physician, there has been a focus on my job and profession. And you have met quite a few of my colleagues now. And I'm pleased to say you are going to meet another one today. I've said before, and I will say again, that my guests through this season are people that have inspired me professionally and personally and continue to do so. I really feel that they are game changers. They are people who really do inspire and drive us forward. They are all enthusiasts and they have particular skills and expertise and I think life lessons that we can all learn from. And I'm really honoured to introduce today's guest. Again, someone who was on my list from the beginning to include in this first season. And I'm glad to say that his very busy schedule, we managed to happily combine a day off, obviously on the shift workers weekend, a Wednesday, and to record this conversation.
Advocacy is around working with the system and working with inside the system to influence change. I think activism is, and it's all about a spectrum and it's all about perspective. So, I can be an advocate about, for example, access block and overcrowding, work within the college. But, the people in government or the health department might actually see that as being an activist.
That was the voice and wisdom of active advocate, Dr Simon Judkins. Dr Judkins is an emergency physician with a wealth of clinical experience. He's been a practicing clinician for over 2 decades. He has held numerous leadership positions within the Australasian College of Emergency Medicine and most notably recent past president of the college. He's also had many positions within the Australian Medical Association. He is Deputy Director and more recently Acting Director, as we'll discuss, of a major public tertiary hospital in Melbourne, Victoria. And as the introduction here suggests, he is perhaps most well known for his role in advocacy in many areas within our specialty, most notably in equity and access to healthcare, in refugee health, for indigenous populations, for mental health. He has also championed Access Block and Choosing Wisely campaigns and has been a prominent voice, particularly in recent years, for the impact of climate change on the health of our communities. He was a frontline worker in the bushfires at the beginning of this year. This is something, again, that we'll discuss in this conversation. And as the introduction might suggest, navigating that line between activism and advocacy, and how to marry those two to happily become engaged and mobilise people and effect change. I'm very conscious that our conversation comes at the end of this most terrible year. Many people are exhausted, and many people have greater challenges still to come in the days, weeks and months ahead, and particularly looking around the world. And I think it is very easy to lose hope. And we do talk about hope and the importance of hope in this conversation. I still left our dialogue hopeful and certainly reinvigorated. I really think listening to someone like Simon reaffirms my commitment to the job I do, but also my commitment to our community and to the people around me. So with that said, enjoy today's conversation. I want to thank you again for being willing to come on my little passion project. I think, many of the people that I've had on this series, this is the first series, I personally consider them game changers, not only in medicine, but their respective fields. And I hope that you know that you're somebody that that you have inspired me professionally and personally, even from a distance in recent years. And you maybe don't know that's the impact, but I think consider you a mentor and a teacher. And I listened to you just in where I am now in this very city just over 12 months ago, give a very powerful speech as one of your last duties as president of our college. And, I certainly left that enthused and fired up. And I think nobody knew exactly what was going to unfold. And you had no idea what was going to transpire just after that. But I think a lot of what you said is even more relevant. Was then. But, before we go into the meats of this conversation, because I really want to go into, you've got a big role in advocacy and activism in medicine, and I think you really are somebody who's making positive impact on the culture. But I wanted to start a bit lighter, and by way of introduction, because I don't actually know the answer to this. I really want to know why it was medicine, and particularly emergency medicine for you.
That's an interesting one. So, look, my grandfather was a GP, and he was, I suppose, he says an old school GP, but he was one of those GPs who just lived and breathed medicine, and he loved it. And he worked in Box Hill. He worked in the clinic with Ed Bretnell, actually. When Ed Bretnell, who was one of the founders of the college, way back when, so one of the founding fellows of the college, Ed had come over from the UK, worked with my grandfather. Ed started working in the emergency department at Box Hill Hospital, and he was integral to the formation of the college. And the college is hopefully putting out this year the history of the college, the first 35 years, and Ed's very much part of that story. And so I suppose the influence of my grandfather being a GP and really sort of, I suppose, as a young kid, seeing him and the influence he had on his community, then meeting Ed Bretnell. Medicine was just one of those things that I wanted to do. And then emergency medicine, I think it was the same things that struck me way back then that still keep me inspired to do it now. I remember walking into my early experiences. I did a surgical rotation and I was holding retractors and felt it was incredibly, I wasn't that enthused about it, but walking into an emergency department, I think the vibe, the team, people backing each other up, the excitement of it, and it was just I sort of fell into it. So that was back in the days of working at Moorabbin Hospital, which doesn't exist anymore, that emergency department there, and then at Monash when it had sort of just opened in the early days of Monash Medical Centre. So walking in there with, Di Edgerton Warburton was working in the department there, and it was just, it just seemed like a natural fit.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same things that attract me to working in an ED now. Is now I'm at the other end of that spectrum. I'm working up in Echuca now, and there's lots of young docs there and medical students, and seeing them get excited about the same things that I got excited about when I was starting out. I think it's a sort of a cycle of life.
Yeah, I want to talk about that while you're not on the golf course and you're actually up in Echuca. But I'll get that.
There's a nice golf course up in Echuca, so we just haven't actually got there yet.
So I think we've spoken a bit about the importance of longevity of practice and trying to cultivate niche either in medicine or out with, just to sustain you. And I was preparing for this, it did strike me that before I even knew what a side hustle was, that this was something that you were probably doing quite a few decades ago. So I mean, I certainly recall when I was a registrar, we would go to the North Fitzroy bar. You had us taken as part of our social
that's right, the Deco Wine Bar. Yeah.
And urban legend had it that you and your brother had a TV program. So I just wanted to talk a bit about that. And is that something that you think has been actually important to your career? Is it something that's made it more difficult?
Oh, look, in a way. So I remember when I first got through my fellowship exam, and I was working at the Austin, and George Bradbury was the director at the time. And I remember at the Christmas party, and I said to George, I'm happy. I've got a lot of other things going on at the moment. And at that stage, we had a wine bar, Deco Wine Bar. I'd opened with a few friends, and my brother and I were renovating houses, and we were doing all sorts of things there. Had a football show going on Channel 31, a community TV station at the time, and I just said, look, I'll do your Friday evenings and your Saturday evenings, but I don't want to do any of this clinical support time stuff. I'm not interested in that. I'll do the work, I'll see patients, and I'll go home. Yeah. And things obviously evolved since then. But again, it's a funny sort of thing, because going through all those years, all that time at the college, and spending a lot of time doing all that sort of that advocacy work, and probably less time on the floor seeing patients, and a hell of a lot of time traveling around and doing a lot of other stuff. One of the great things about doing emergency medicine is now, as I said, I go up to Echuca once a week, and I go there and see patients, and as I said, talk to the junior doctors, and actually find that incredibly therapeutic. I think reinventing yourself and taking on different things along the way actually just keeps you fresh and inspired. And we all go through phases, I think, of feeling a bit stressed and burnt out and over it, whatever that might be at the time. But there's always a way to reinvent yourself and find something else that keeps you inspired and moving on. So I'm sort of at that point now with, as I said, those trips that I do up to the regional Victoria and working for me at the moment. That's really, really enjoyable.
How did that come about? Was that something you actively sought out, or
Oh, look, again, part of the work that I've been doing at the college is around the workforce stuff. And many people who are listening to this may have, heard about, the work we're doing around the distribution or the evolution of the emergency medical workforce, the training numbers, where people are working, sustainable careers. And we've been working very hard with FACEMs, with faculty chairs, with different jurisdictions to try and get a plan, a roadmap. I shouldn't use the word roadmap, but a plan to actually evolve the emergency medical workforce. And so we have the right balance of trainees coming in. We have the right balance of opportunities in the workplace, but we also get emergency physicians out into regional rural areas where they're desperately needed. I suppose moving through all of that, it's very hard. Again, I've always been somebody who is, I think you've got to walk the walk to talk the talk. And I think my leadership style, I suppose, has always been about walking the walk. And I've never been, even when I was director, acting director at my hospital, I was always doing, on the floor, doing 2 or 3 clinical shifts a week, because I just don't think you can bring people along for the ride unless you're actually on the ride yourself.
What I have written down here, Simon, because you mentioned about walking the walk in your speech, and what I've written below it is, he's somebody who walks the talk. That's exactly the way I see you. And I found it interesting, though, that you said, and maybe that's not the case now, but certainly at the beginning of your career, you kind of beseech the audience to, and that was a group of emergency physicians trainees, to be braver. You wished you had been braver, and I consider you someone who I consider very brave and courageous in our specialty, and really, you are somebody who looks to where we need to be. I find that interesting. Why do you say you wish you had been braver?
I just think there's so many things that we need to do better. And I think there are so many things about our healthcare system and our communities that need to be better. And I think that it takes people to step up and step outside of their comfort zone. And no matter how much you do, I mean, I suppose, I suppose I'm very, very wary of the fact that in regardless of what I've done, I've always had a lot of privilege. Being born and raised in Melbourne, having parents that I haven't had to move. I've been always very well supported. I've got a stable family. So regardless of the advocacy and all the work we're to try and improve systems to advocate for, vulnerable patient groups, indigenous health, I've always had a comfort zone. And it's easy, I suppose, to be an advocate and push for change when you're actually still got a comfort zone. And so I think in some respects, the being braver is really stepping outside that comfort zone. So I think that's one of the things. One of the things, I suppose, being in a role like I have and being in a very fortunate life, I've always had a comfort zone. So therefore, it's been a lot easier in some respects to actually be an advocate for change because I've always had a fallback position. Where I think for many people, they're advocates because they it's such a critical part that they have to they have to change. Whereas I think for many of us, and I think that's one of the things in Australian society generally, I think that's why we don't see, Australia's been a very relatively wealthy, well-off country, and so things like refugee health and things like indigenous health and things like climate change and health. Most people go, oh, yeah, it's bad, but, I'm comfortable, so therefore I don't need to do anything about it because it's not in their face. It's not affecting them personally. So I think that's why I suppose that's what I meant, is that,
And I suppose the flip side is that, from my perspective, is I'm someone who sees you as, you actually went to the scene for bushfires to actually see what was happening at the ground level. You volunteered your time. You also volunteered a lot of your time to be president of, our college and take an active leadership role, and how many hours that you put into that. I mean, I think if you jotted down how much time you spent living, working, breathing our college and specialty. And then here you are up in Echuca. I mean, a lot of people would say, well, that's going out of your comfort zone. There's not many people that would, potentially want to do that once a week at your stage in their career.
Oh, yeah. But again, I think, you have to take people. I've always felt that in order to make a change, you need to take advantage of, or you need to use the privilege that you've actually been gifted with. And I think and I've said this before, I mean, my pathway into the role as the college president actually wasn't littered with barriers and potholes, and it was very, very different, and therefore I felt an obligation that I actually had to take advantage of that and actually had to make the most of it. And it wasn't going to be something that you just go, oh, good, I'm now the president of the college, my work is done. Becoming president of the college was the first step, and actually then trying to go, oh, shit, I've got to do something with this role. Yeah. And it was never going to be for me, it was never going to be the end of, that journey. It was always going to be the start of the next, hopefully, big thing. And hopefully, I would have hate to have looked back on that time in 10 years and say, well, geez, I really didn't do enough with that.
Just on that, what do you think in that term as president? What are the kind of, for you looking back on it, the more personally satisfying areas where we've made some inroads and progress to decrease some of the barriers for maybe people coming after you?
I suppose again that's always for other it's interesting because I still think there's so much unfinished work, and I suppose we started a lot of work, and that work will always continue to evolve. I suppose in many respects it's up to other people to make that call about what has changed. I think the thing I felt most, I think when you made an impact when you do get those messages from the trainees, for example, who just say, look at this, and people from other colleges saying it's great to see what ACEM is doing. I wish our college would be like that. But when you're in the middle of it, I don't think you actually recognise. I don't think you necessarily recognise what's happening and what impact you're having on the wider world. I think when you do get that somebody saying, thanks for coming up to Queensland, for example, and helping us in our individual department to work out this mental health issue, and you get that feedback, that's incredibly important. I think looking back, the things around the mental health advocacy, I think has been really important. And I think now that we're seeing a whole lot of people, communities, our College of Psychs, for example, they're all talking about mental health in emergency departments, and that's become the real focus of a lot of the reform that we're going through now. So I think we've worked really, really hard to make that an indicator of system dysfunction. So I think I've been really pretty pleased with what we've done there. I think, our issues around diversity, equity, social justice, and seeing obviously, the change in the makeup of many of our committees and the board now at the college, and seeing a much more, balanced representation in all of those committees has been encouraging. There's still a lot more work to do. Particularly in areas such as, director roles and DMT roles and things like that within the hospital system. But in the college itself, I think we've made some really good changes there. I just think the level of engagement and just seeing new leaders come through, I think that's probably been the thing that has been most I think most satisfying is seeing new people involved in the college, and it's been opened up to a whole lot more people, and we're seeing new leaders come through the system. And I think that was hopefully something we always encouraged, that this was really, advocacy and changing the system is really up to everybody to step in and do their bit. But we've really seen, I think, new leadership coming through, which I think has been the most encouraging thing.
Fantastic. I mean, I had all of those things written down. I did want to focus a bit on climate change as a public health issue. I mean, I've been reading quite a lot of the literature in preparation for this, and I think Nicholas Talley has been putting a lot out there. Certainly,
absolutely. Nicholas has been fantastic, hasn't he?
So for anyone listening who's not familiar with Dr. Talley, I mean, I think most people are. They've certainly read the book. There is a joint commission. He's the editor of the Medical Journal of Australia between the MJA and the Lancet that have really been looking at the science and the evidence. And it's interesting that the Lancet said in 2009 that probably one of the biggest threats to global health moving forward was climate change. But then they kind of changed it up in 2016 and said, actually, this is probably one of the biggest opportunities to make an impact. And I know that you have been a very prominent voice in this respect, certainly in recent years. And I mean, why is this an important issue for us as health professionals?
Look, I think as health professionals, I mean, I think, look, it's interesting. I think as health professionals, we're advocates for at all different levels. And I was thinking about this before about, we advocate for better health for everybody within, whether that's the individual in the emergency department in front of you, or whether it's advocating for better systems to ensure that your community can access better health, or whether it's advocating for prevention of disease. And I think at all those different levels, healthcare professionals need to be advocates. And I think climate change really, as we said, is the biggest health threat that we have. And I think we've been, in the past, the message has always been clouded by politics. And and in Australia in particular, that's the carbon producing industries, and the climate change deniers have really clouded it. But I think if you basically look at the fundamental issue with global warming and climate change, it ultimately comes down to health of our communities and the health of our next generation. You look at the bushfires, for example, down in that we had last year, and the ongoing impacts. I mean, people talk about how many people died in the bushfires as a direct impact of the bushfires, and I think there was 33 documented lives lost actually in the bushfires themselves. But then you look at the wider impacts on the healthcare of Australians, and there was, I think, 420 deaths across the country attributed to climate change. Then there was thousands of people admitted into hospital. But then if you look at the
jobs,
mental health impacts, and there's still people from last summer's bushfires are living in caravans and have lost their jobs, and their kids are scarred by that and will be scarred by that for the rest of their lives.
You actually did some work through that period. Any kind of reflections on when you actually went to many of the local communities?
So I spent some time in Mallacoota. So I was landed in Mallacoota on the 2nd of January, so the day after the bushfires had gone through there, and as a field emergency medical officer working with Ambulance Victoria, and we were sort of partly flown and partly brought in by boat around the coast, and arrived in Mallacoota at 1 o'clock in the morning with this sort of red glow surrounding the town. And again, the most devastating there was people with respiratory illnesses. People just need to get out because of without having access to health care, their medications, and the concerns about the exacerbation of their sort of chronic illness getting worse without that access. And then the high level of stress and anxiety of parents with children going, I just need to get my children out of here. Spending days breathing in bushfire smoke. And then the devastation of the community as well. And the community still, although there are more stories coming out about rebuilding, that's after 12 months of living in caravans.
And I think we were still reeling from that, and then this pandemic has unfolded, and those communities haven't recovered, and then have been given a second, longer blow.
And I think we've looked at, for example, the rise. One of the things we've seen over the last 12 months is we've seen this rise in presentations in emergency departments of young adults and adolescents with mental health issues, increasing anxiety, self-harm, suicide attempts, overdoses, eating disorders, and there's no doubt, and if you talk to the Pat McGorrys, Ian Hickeys of the world, they will tell you that this is because there's a whole generation who are losing hope. They see the impact of the bushfires, and we have a government that does nothing about it. And then we see COVID, which is, a pandemic that's devastated the world and economies and impacted their prospects of employment, secure employment. It's impacted their education. It's impacted their social education. And so all of these things combining together to have a generation of, adolescents and young adults who have such a high level of uncertainty and a lack of hope. I mean, there's a lot of innocence that they've lost. And I've got 3 teenage boys, and, they're in those really formative years of their life. And, you want them to grow up in a world that actually has, hope that the future is going to be better.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that. I mean, my mum sent me a nice picture from Scotland this morning of a rainbow from their house. I'm hoping it extends to Hobart and maybe to Dubai, and my brother as well, those two. Yeah. And I want to talk about hope, because I certainly read, I look, and I immerse myself in my job, and I can occasionally despair and think, well, what can I do? Where is the hope here? And I think that it's important that we don't lose hope, and that and I think certainly from my perspective, I want to know where can I start? What we are seeing a lot of doctors in particular wanting to be more vocal. And I know it needs to start at micro level, but we want to be active on political platforms. We want to make a difference in our workplaces and for our patients. We want to be advocates. So where do you start? What advice do you have to me and my colleagues who do this?
I think there's a whole lot of different levels that you get involved in. And I think everybody needs to find their own pathway and their own passion. I think ultimately it is that, working within where you can have the impact, which is in your hospital, in your emergency department, changing the way, and particularly if you're looking at things like, what you can do to impact climate change, for example, or global warming. I mean, our healthcare systems churn out 7% of our carbon footprint.
Yeah. I feel like I conserve all my plastics and do all my, try to do things at home. And then I go into work, I suture a window and I open up. And I'm like, gee, I think I've just wasted a week's worth of trying to do some good at home by walking into hospital.
I mean, there is so much waste within healthcare. I mean, it links in a bit with, the work we've done with, choosing wisely, for example. We can extend that. Choosing wisely is about being resource stewards for the healthcare system and not actually wasting a lot of a precious resource. And again, I mean, that can extend into, how your hospital can actually decrease its carbon footprint and become more effective, more efficient, more sustainable. And I think, doctors want that. Junior doctors really want that. Yeah. We're seeing a whole generation of medical students and junior doctors coming through the system who talk about sustainability as part of their, that's just what they do now. So I think, we need to actually encourage them to step up and take a lead. But I think beyond that, getting involved certainly in the college, I mean, everybody needs, I suppose, some sort of vehicle to be able to sort of hitch their wagon to and have that impact. So I think, I'm a member of the Doctors for the Environment, certainly working through the college and the different groups there at the college. I think that's where you can start to have some impact. But I think, we talk about, I think, I think part of the conversation we were going to have was about, what advocacy means and activism. And I was thinking about activism and
quite a bold word, activism. But I mean, I actually do encourage. I think it has negative connotations. I don't know what.
I think it does, because I think working with the system and working with inside the system to influence change. I think activism is. And it's all about a spectrum and it's all about perspective. So, I can be an advocate about, for example, access block and overcrowding, work within the college. But, the people in government or the health department might actually see that as being an activist, because some of the messages we're giving them might be pissing them off a little bit. So I think advocacy and activism are a spectrum, but generally I think advocacy is seen as being working with the system. Activism is seen to be working against the system, but I think they're just a spectrum.
Yeah.
But I think the whole point about activism is that you're just being active and actually trying to make a change. And I'd rather be active than passive.
Yeah, nice. And I think that engaged and invested active advocacy is what I associate most with you, Simon. And on that topic, given that you've got a wealth of experience now in a leadership role, any advice, pitfalls, pearls for navigating that spectrum between advocacy and activism, not only in your own system, but maybe also interacting with media and government?
I suppose, first of all, it takes time. Nothing's going to happen overnight. But I think if you start that there's a whole lot of people out there who are going to be on the same bandwagon. So it's just about finding those people. And I think the college for me has been that vehicle, and it has been finding people across the country who are engaged in similar thoughts and ideas. So, and I think social media helps with that. You can make those connections clearly. But again, I think, it can be something that, there's a fine line between passion and, pragmatism and burnout. And, there's a lot of banging your head against a brick wall, particularly in some of the things that I found most frustrating in this whole journey has been, the issues around, for example, in emergency medicine around access block and overcrowding, no matter how hard and how much advocacy work that we do, and how, from our perspective, it just makes sense that why wouldn't we actually put more resource in the system, reform the system to make it better for patients, And 10 years later, we still have seen the same issues. And to me, I suppose that's been one of the most frustrating parts of the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years. But at the same time, we've got more and more people.
I remember when I was a registrar, and that was my first, interactions with you. And I remember before Access Block was probably even really formally a thing. You were already working to highlight the blockages and the reasons for lack of flow-through departments, and you were making changes. Certainly at the Austin, you were doing that when that was 2000.
And I think it is one of those things that you go, well, again, I suppose that's been one of the most frustrating parts, is that we're still many years on, and we're still seeing a system that actually doesn't actually understand that. We see lots of headlines about ambulance ramping. We see lots of headlines about overcrowded emergency departments, but still, it just seems to be a system that an issue that we just haven't been able to solve.
How do you think there's a way through there? Is there a way through?
I think it's about engaging the rest of the system, and I think maybe the work we're doing with mental health in particular has been something that we'll see some. I think that's driving some change. So I think we've done so much work around highlighting the way patients who need to access the mental health care system or mental health support end up with nowhere else to go. And so they end up in our emergency departments at 3:00 in the morning and end up staying for days. I think the work we've done with that and really highlighted that has become a driver for change. So I think we'll see. I'm hopeful. There's been so much focus on mental health and the Royal Commission and the Productivity Commission that we'll actually see some drivers for change there. And I think that will be the impetus to hopefully change and address other blockers in the system as well. But then again, we've had lots of different inquiries and papers and reports, and I see Scott Morrison the other day saying, well, we need another inquiry into mental health. No, we don't. We just need to actually take some action. So I think there's a difference between the interaction between healthcare actually and political interference is often very frustrating. But I'm hoping that particularly the focus on mental health will be a driver for system change.
And just one more thing on that, because we have said you are a doer, and you've probably sat through many meetings now, many agendas, and how do you in your leadership role kind of cut to the chase and navigate that with actually trying to make things happen at the end of the day? And we have seen, I really like through this pandemic, we've managed to cut a lot of red tape, and we have managed to make things happen, and that's been a really good kind of positive momentum.
I think that has been interesting, hasn't it? Because certainly through the pandemic and the use of evidence and science to drive change. And I think particularly in Australia, it's been incredibly positive. If anything positive can come out of it, the fact that we've actually had science and evidence driving the politics, and the opposite has happened overseas, where we're seeing the science and the evidence ignored, and political decisions have actually got in the way of a proper, addressing the pandemic. And we're all hopeful that will roll into other issues. For example, the way we address climate change and the health impacts of climate change. So there's been some really weird things that have come out of it, though, isn't it? So you look at, for example, in many countries they've let politics interfere with the pandemic response, but they're much more proactive in the areas of climate change and global warming. Whereas in Australia, we've had the opposite, where we've actually followed the science and we're ignoring the science on global warming and climate change. So, sometimes it just, I just get confused about it, but it doesn't stop me from trying to continue to do the right thing.
I wanted to move on to talk about, because we have talked about there's so many hats, and I think there may be another project on the back of this. But I many of the people I've interviewed on this podcast have either authors or books, or have certainly been very managed to recommend a few books to me. So I recently got round to reading emergency stories from clinicians from the shop.
There's still a copy
I have read it. No, I've read it all now.
Yeah.
It'd been on my list for ages. So that was a book that you authored a number of years ago. Oh, I mean, it was fantastic. It really, it's like a busman's holiday, taking that on holiday to read, but it really does capture the essence of our specialty. So what was the inspiration behind that? Because I don't think we have.
Look, again, I think that was really about, again, it was about advocacy for the profession and again, what we do in EDs. And I just, not many people understand what actually happens inside the four walls, those very rubbery walls that we have in an emergency department. Our inpatient colleagues don't understand what goes on down there. Certainly the community, I think, have an idea through some of the TV shows that are now around. But back then, which was 2012, maybe, I think, or 14, we put that book together. It was basically, I wanted to tell the story about what actually happens when we go into an emergency department and the things that happen there. And again, trying to point out, I suppose, some of the things that we were raising in that book then. Now we talk about moral injury, for example, which has been, one of the burnout and the stress that clinicians. I think looking back in those stories, we're telling stories of moral injury. We just didn't have a term for it.
Yeah.
And if we wrote some of those stories now, we'd be using different terms. But it was really, I suppose, again, trying to raise awareness of the issues that happen in emergency departments, how that impacts patient care. It was about vulnerable groups, vulnerable patients, and just, again, telling a story about the depth and breadth of the work we do and the actual value, the importance of the work we do.
And I think despite what you said there about moral injury, and there's probably some therapy in writing about it for clinicians, and also, some of the real human tragedy that some of the stories, bring out. I still think that was quite a joyful book, and it was a real celebration of the great privilege to do this job.
And I think so too. Yeah, I think so. And many of the stories are, I've always said, it's an incredible privilege for the work we do is incredibly. I think we're incredibly privileged to do the work we do. We just don't recognise it. And I think that book was really trying to highlight that we are incredibly fortunate to be able to help people who need help. And whether it's it's somebody comes to the emergency department because they're homeless, they need somebody to care for them and support them. The fact that they come to the emergency department for that help and we can try and assist them, I think still is people sometimes it is a privilege to be able to actually help people on the best and worst days of their lives. I remember speaking to a mutual colleague of ours who shall remain nameless, who was had taken some time out of training and was working overseas, and said he was sitting on a beach somewhere after doing some work in a local community, and he said he read the book, and at the end of it he realised that this is why he wanted to come back and continue his training, because it just refocused. When you're working in an ED, it's very, very hard at the end of a very, very busy shift where you're running from one place to another and feel like you're putting out spot fires, to reflect back on a day and think about the good things that you have done. I think within every day that we work in the ED, there are good things that we do that have an enormous impact on everybody's lives. But we just, I suppose, because we do them all day, every day, we don't necessarily recognise that they're actually having a huge impact on people's lives. And I think that was just, a way of refocusing, I suppose, helping people refocus on the fact that we actually do good work. And if we weren't there, there'd be, hundreds of thousands of people across the country who wouldn't access healthcare that they need.
Any standouts in that book for you? Standout stories or personal? I know you had quite a bit of contribution to it.
It's interesting how some of the stories have actually, still had that impact. There was a story of Ruby, who was a lady who passed away during a heat wave, and And that's come up a number of, and that's more relevant now than it was back then, because going back to what we were just talking about, we're seeing, heat waves going through all major cities in Australia. We're seeing these, maps of Australia with highest ever temperatures. And so I think that's a story that continues to remain relevant. I think the story about the misdiagnosis of meningitis in a baby and how that impacts, and again, the system impacts. And again, it was interesting to reflect writing that book then, again, about the focus that we have now on the impacts of the system that we work in and how that impacts our capacity or our ability to do our job properly.
But also our humanity. I mean, I think that particularly that last one you refer to, because that's something that I will always remember. And, we are professionals. We are, very highly skilled. We've trained for many, many years, but we're human. And I think that was the power message.
And I think that we are always going, and I think if you're not impacted by it, the work we do, then, there's that balance, isn't it? When you get to the point where you aren't emotionally impacted by the work that you do every day, then you are at getting that point where you need to stop and take a breath and think about how you reinvent yourself and do something different. And I think I think we all get to that point where the emotional impact of the work can drive that, but I think we just need to be so mindful of the fact that we do need to stop, have a think, and reflect on whether we need to change, refocus. I think that's one of the things, going back to the conversation we were having before, and I know we're sort of going on this sort of roller coaster ride of stories, but going back to the work that I'm now doing up in Echuca is like a breath of fresh air. It's taken me out of a system that was, I was completely overwhelmed in, and really, I think halfway through this year, I was in a sort of a mind fog. There was just so much going on, and it was so stressful that, to stop and then be able to go up to, a little beautiful part of Victoria and have an impact up there in an ED that needs people to, needs emergency physicians to come up and help build up the systems there. It's just been, as I said, a bit of a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't acknowledged that you've been an emergency physician in all of those other roles, but also working in Victoria, in Melbourne, through the worst affected state in our country, to be on the front line. And I suspect that I've not appreciated what you and my colleagues there have gone through, having a different in a different state.
Look, again, it's everybody will have their own story in it, but my working and my listening to the stories across the different EDs, just the whole impact, just the whole 12 months has been an incredible story. As I said, rolling on from bushfires into, in actual fact, after I stepped down from my role as college president last year, I was actually going, and I was still in the deputy director role at the hospital I work in, and I was going to step down from that role, and then our director left, and so I was asked to, whether I would mind stepping into the role as the acting director at that time until they found a new director. And then, of course, that was the start of the pandemic. So then I stepped into a role as acting director right at the start of all that. So my plan wasn't really to do that, but then all of a sudden we took that on. But look, it was the response from our team, from our emergency department, was incredible. Just an amazing bunch of people, and a lot of them. But then again, across the system, linking in with the ED directors on the director forums and how they all stood up, and just the I suppose the positive attitude and the way everybody pulled together to actually get through this thing was just was inspiring.
I mean, that again has been my experience of solidarity, of information sharing, of literally knocking walls in a small department. I think I mentioned on another podcast, one of our senior nurses in my last workplace said, I've been trying for 3 years to get this to happen, and it took a week. So,
And again, I think there was such a, let's just do this attitude and get it done, which is what emergency physicians love. We have a problem. This is a solution. Let's just fix it. There was so much of that. But, the concern is for many of us now that our systems will just slowly regress back into the way we did things before. And I think we're seeing that, the concern is that we're seeing that in the way EDs are now, going back to access and overcrowded waiting rooms again. You're going, well, what should we have learned? What should the system have learned through COVID? And we're seeing a sort of a regression back to the way we ran the system before COVID, which is, if that's incredibly disappointing if we go back and we don't learn from all the, the changes and the flexibility and the adaptability and innovation that we put in place to actually make everything work.
Well, I hope that having this conversation will maybe kind of reinvigorate. I mean, I am conscious it's, at a time where everybody is exhausted, but the need is still there. And if anything, it's probably greater.
Yeah, and look, and it's very hard to maintain that momentum for change when we've actually had so much change. And people, again, when you get to the end of the year, particularly right now, it's 2 days before Christmas, everybody's exhausted. The last thing people want to do is try and continue to evolve and innovate through, into January. Very concerned that a lot of the lessons learned about COVID, about the system response, about working across units from ambulance through EDs into inpatient teams, we're just going to go back to the way we did things before, and our system won't be any better performing or better off than it was beforehand. So that's the biggest concern I think most ED docs and directors have at the moment.
We know we started this day talking about the book now, and I think you probably had a few other ideas. And I just wonder if this year's experience might be something that you would think about in terms of your future authoring potential.
Yeah, next year I've been asked to. There's a couple of things on that. I've been I'm going to start hopefully doing a little bit of work with Croaky, which is one of the online. I love the work that those.
I'm going to link. They actually linked your speech, so I will put that in the show notes. Here.
Oh, okay.
To read that.
Well, hopefully hopefully one of the things I'm going to do next year. Well, one of the things I'm planning on doing next year is just writing some articles with them, which will be again really exciting thing to do and get back into that sort of zone. And we're hopefully going to do, as you know, the ACEM conference in 2022 is coming to Melbourne.
Yeah, that was the next thing. I've got here what Simon did next. And I will say, because I did refer to the golf course, you did, because you are quite active on social media, and you did say, look, I'm going to be stopping my role as deputy director. I'm past president of the college. Maybe now is the time to take up golf. Instead, as you can see, I don't think that's really transpired.
Oh no! I had a golf game with my brother, my son, and my father on the 28th of December last year.
Oh, so you've got to recreate that.
And I've got another golf game booked for the 28th of December this year. So I'll get out once a year and have a round of golf.
So as Gary Player said, you've got to keep playing, keep practicing.
Yeah, I haven't really taken that with the level of sort of enthusiasm that I need. But
I don't think I'll put a wager on you winning that one.
No, God, no.
So excitingly, I was listening to Andrew Davies' podcast, Mastering Intensive Care, listening to Roger Harris and Oliver Flower, and they were talking about CODA change and obviously the upcoming conference and their visions for that. So now you're going to be convening the ACEM in Melbourne in 2020, which is very exciting. Is that
yes.
Right?
Yeah, that's right. So,
I mean, obviously the landscape could still be very different then, but I'd love to know what your visions for that are at this stage.
Hopefully by the time your podcast is launched, we will have actually launched the website. So I'm not going to, I'll just be telling people what's on the website they can access. So I'm not going to be, but look, it's going to be Melbourne in 2022. We'll be combining obviously the ACEM conference and our ACEM annual conference. The theme for the conference is Better Care for a Better World. It's really going to be focused on, even though it's in Melbourne, very much a South Pacific focused conference. And so, as you know, we know some of our emergency visitors in our college do some incredible work within our region. So reaching into the South Pacific nations and beyond. So we're hoping to make it a very much a South Pacific focused conference and talk about the things that, you know, emergency medicine systems and emergency medicine can do across developing nations to improve healthcare. But yeah, there's a whole spectrum. Of course, there'll be the normal IFM, you know, there'll be the trauma and pediatrics and all the research arms, but very much focusing on healthcare advocacy, healthcare equities across the world. We've got an amazing committee that we've put together, looking forward to really start to flesh that out over the next 18 months. We're hoping, of course, that it'll be a conference that now I suppose they're hybrid conferences, so we'll have, you know, a very much an on-site presence, and we're hoping certainly with the Australia, New Zealand, South Pacific contexts, you know, with vaccinations coming aboard, we'll actually be able to travel. But also clearly conferences opening up to the rest of the world and developing nations. So we can see emergency clinicians and nurses and ambulance officers from all over the world being able to link in and participate in that conference as well. So, you know, we're trying to make it as inclusive as we possibly can. So we're very excited about it. I think, you know, Melbourne, I think our college always puts on a great conference. We've had a tradition of doing that. I think Melbourne's a great place for people to come to. So I'm pretty excited about what we're going to deliver there. And we're working with a couple of our committee members to hopefully at the same time release another book around emergency care as well. So, but have a much more global perspective on emergency care systems and what emergency clinicians do within their, you know, different parts of the world.
And you said that website's actually going to be live relatively soon.
We're just finalising that at the moment, and we'll have basically, the website should be up and running and hopefully in the next few weeks. So it looks like, you know, we're hoping to get it up by December, but I think it'll probably be early January. We'll have that website up and running.
I can update the show notes with that link.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, really keen to get as many people engaged. We really want to get, you know, offer opportunities for particularly speakers and presenters from developing countries to be able to get to Australia. And we're looking at how we can, you know, provide the resources for many of the great, you know, many of the emergency physicians within our region in South Pacific to be able to come to Melbourne to present and participate in that conference. So we're hoping it'll be something pretty special.
Perfect. I mean, I usually finish these conversations talking a bit about you personally and, you know, a lot of your personal definitions of health and how you actually, you know, maintain your own well-being day to day. And when we have talked about and I hope you don't mind me saying now at this point, you actually said, and I was kind of relieved, I said to hear you say that you were having some downtime today. So I think it's good for me and good for other people to hear that you do have some time off, because you really do so much. And I know, you know, you've also got family and trying to make all of that work. And we do talk about the misnomer of balance and how balance is sometimes going all in and sometimes it's pulling back. So do you have a working definition of health for yourself?
Look, to be honest, I've never felt really, I think I now know what burnout actually really feels like. You know, I've never really felt that. But I think towards the end of this year, particularly, you know, getting into the end of that second wave of COVID and everything that brought, and just the amount of time, both working with the health departments in that active director role, continuing to do the college stuff, I think, you know, I was completely exhausted. And I said before, you know, I felt like, you know, sitting in meetings, I was in a bit of a brain fog, and just looking at that now. I think the best thing that happened was actual, you know, was to be able to step away from a lot of that. So moving away from being the acting director and having somebody else take on that role, to being able to stop and then reevaluate what was going to be the important stuff moving forward has been a significant change. So, so I think physically and emotionally, I was, pretty worn out. Now, back into sort of, I suppose, enthusiastically working with, as I said, the guys up in Echuca and working out how we're going to build a team up there. So I think I've been able to move back into a space where I'm doing things that I really like doing as opposed to doing stuff that I have to do. So, it hasn't taken a long time to feel better about the day-to-day work, but also I suppose just very cognizant about the fact that getting out and making sure that you're exercising every day, cooking more meals at home, spending more time with the kids, even though they're at a point now they're all out getting jobs and they're out with their mates. So but I think going back in and focusing on the things that are enjoyable about work, because as I said, the work we do is an incredible privilege. And we should actually really enjoy what we do because it makes a difference. So refocusing on that, I think, has made the end of the year, I think, for me, much better than the start. Yep. Well, probably, I think, for most of the people at the moment, the end of the year, particularly in Australia, is probably much better than the start. But I think on a personal level, at least I can feel I can, pick up a few books and start reading them now. And really focus on, as I said, those things that I really enjoy doing.
And do you have any go-to tools, strategies, things that you do when you're maybe facing a bigger challenge or commitment at work, or struggling? Anything that you pull out of your toolbox?
Yeah, I don't know. Look, I've always been somebody who's always got something happening, and I think I'm very fortunate in some, because there's work stuff that has to be done, and there's stuff that I just enjoy doing. So, for example, working on the ACEM stuff and coming up with, themes and goals and coming up with visions. I think as long as we've always got a vision and a plan, then that's always gives you that little bit of inspiration. I think we all need a little bit of inspiration. And I really enjoy that. I mean, I'm very lucky because I actually really enjoy the work we do, because I think, as I said before, there's always an opportunity to make things better. And I think if you do it in a role where there's always an opportunity to make things better for other people, then that's enough inspiration for me, I think, to keep going.
Yeah. And the final thing, we've talked about, I think we've now coined the term self-care Sundays, but we've made it self-care Wednesdays for emergency physicians because that's the day we're usually off.
Yeah, that's right.
Either we're both off on a Wednesday and today's Wednesday. Yeah. And I think you've mentioned golf, and I'm sure foodie's going to feature here, but what if you could design a day for yourself, what would it involve?
Oh, look, I think for me, a day off is... one of those people, sleeping in doesn't happen. So regardless of what day of the week it is, my wife's the same. So she's normally awake at 6:30. And so I'd sort of try and stay into bed till about 7 o'clock. But cooking breakfast, getting some exercise, and then thinking about what we're going to cook for dinner. I've really enjoyed actually cooking. One of my oldest son managed to convince us all that we need to all cut out red meats. We're very much moving towards sort of a vegetarian diet in our house, which I think is then inspired all of us to become better cooks, because I think there's cooking has come back into what we do, and trying to read some books. I've always been a fairly avid reader, and I really lost that. So at the moment I'm reading Women and Leadership by Julia Gillard.
Oh, it's brilliant. That was my last read. So good.
Yeah. So I'm halfway through that now, and I think that's a fantastic book for anybody to read. So, and then looking forward to getting into some writing again. I've said that I'm going to do it. I've just got to find the space in my day to actually start doing it, start getting some of those ideas to put down on paper and hopefully produce stuff that people find interesting to read.
And maybe go into the foodie, have your team win.
Yeah, unfortunately my team doesn't win much. So, that's always been one of the tricky things. I love going to the footy, but it's always an emotional roller coaster ride when you follow my football club.
Thanks again. I know it's a particularly busy time of year, and I really appreciate you making time for what I think is a very important conversation today. I feel very lucky that we have you in a prominent leadership role in our specialty. And I know this conversation has certainly inspired me, but will empower more of us. I mean, we have an advocacy role every day for our patients as emergency physicians, but I think to have that wider role in, acting within our sphere of influence, but to become active advocates on a wider scale.
Yeah, it's a very odd. To me, it's a very odd position to be in. It's really it is really nice to hear that. But I've always had this view that I'm sitting here in my bedroom, locked away from my teenage kids because they're all out there making noise. I enjoy, as I said, going to the footy, and I've always thought that I've been just a very, very average person, normal person who's had an incredibly privileged life. And to see all the people who have grown along the way and the way they've impacted the system and healthcare and developed amazing careers has been, it's fantastic.
Well, I personally feel it's that humility in the face of what I consider remarkable achievement that attracts certainly me and many of us to you. I'm excited to see what the next 25 years of your career will bring. We talk about this longevity of practice, and you have talked quite a bit about, changing it up, keeping that enthusiasm, and you are an enthusiast. One of our colleagues famously, and I'll never forget the story, he talked about his grandpa who is in Greece, and he was a farmer all his life. And even in his 90s, he kept a couple of animals. So I think it was a couple of goats and a sheep. And he would get up every morning with purpose and go out and count his goats and sheep and check in and see how they were doing. And, I think it's having that passion for something you've done all your life, but still enjoying it. I think my dad's not in medicine, but I can quite clearly seeing him never really retire. I actually think that's kind of wonderful because you have this passion and this purpose that sustains you.
As I said, looking at what my next, 5, 10, whatever years, as I said, I can look at really trying to impact regional and rural healthcare. And I think, as I said, the stuff we're doing in Echuca, hopefully building up a team there. There's a whole lot of EDs and urgent care centres across Australia that need emergency physicians to actually start going out there, doing some work and building them up and offering, their expertise and their knowledge. And I'd encourage any young emergency physician to look at those opportunities, but I'd particularly encourage, older emergency physicians who've been doing the same job for the last 20 years who feel like they're in a little bit of a rut to actually go and have a look and see what's out there, because there's some amazing places to go and work in, fantastic communities that need the skills of, emergency physicians and to work with the amazing GPs that are out there and to make a difference. So, more than happy to, if people want to get in touch and talk about those things, to try and help them with that sort of transition.
Happy for them to contact you if they've maybe listened to this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. You have been listening to Dr Simon Judkins. I personally found this a very rich and valuable conversation. I certainly left reinvigorated and reminded of the great privilege I have to do my job. Simon himself has said that we have a real opportunity to influence the agenda and change the public narrative as emergency physicians. He also said of his own views on his job: we are open 24/7, ready to look after anyone who needs our help. We deal with the most traumatic, most heart-wrenching situations with skill, care, professionalism, and compassion. He says it's a tough gig, but I wouldn't want it any other way. I'm very conscious that many of my colleagues and healthcare workers around the world are currently struggling in the most dire circumstances. And I'm sending love and support and strength to them. I hope that you all get some opportunity to have some downtime over this festive period. I'll be putting links in the show notes to some of the references and resources that we have discussed here. I plan to have one final episode to finish this season, which will probably be released just a little after New Year. I am also working through the New Year period, and that will have an opportunity to reflect on some of the other fantastic conversations I've had with some guests that I'm very grateful to for sharing their time, their wisdom and their expertise, and I want to reflect on some of those really valuable learnings. So thank you again for tuning in, and I look forward to joining you next time.
Again, I've always been somebody else who is, I think you've got to walk the walk to talk the talk. And I think my leadership style, I suppose, has always been about walking the walk. And I've never been, even when I was director, acting director at my hospital, I was always doing, on the floor doing 2 or 3 clinical shifts a week, because I just don't think you can bring people along for the ride unless you're actually on the ride yourself.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.